Good morning. My name is Andrea Rusk. I'm the principal here at Brainerd High School, and I would like to welcome all of our community members here today. I'd welcome students, our staff, and a very special welcome to our veterans for our Brainerd High School Veterans Day program. I'd also like to welcome our elected officials today, members of our school board as well, and Mayor Menk. Please stand for the presentation of the colors by the American Legion Post 255, the VFW Post 1647, and the Disabled American Veterans. We ask that you are silent after the colors are presented. Please remain standing. I'd like to introduce BHS Student Council Representative Nolan Reynolds to lead us in our Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Students, staff, guests, and veterans, we have a very special event today as part of our Veterans Day program. I would like to thank Charlie Ekstrand for bringing this idea into action to give special recognition for one of our special veterans today. I'd like to invite Brainerd Mayor Menk to the podium, and I'd also like to have Walt Straka please come up to the front.
Good morning. I just had the privilege of being able to sit next to Walt Straka, and I'd like to make this proclamation. Whereas Walt Straka fought on the island of Luzon, the Philippines, as part of the 1st Tank Unit of the 194th Tank Battalion in the Far East before World War II, where his unit was ordered to surrender with the fall of Bataan on April 9, 1942. Whereas Walter Straka, the only Brainerd survivor, is one of only 5 Bataan Death March survivors still living, whereas Walter Straka endured 43 months in captivity under unimaginable conditions of deprivation and physical cruelty, and whereas Walt Straka has dealt bravely with the nightmares from his experience, has raised a family of 7, has succeeded in life through hard work and determination, and is an exemplary citizen and role model. The City of Brainerd does hereby proclaim Monday, November 11th, 2019, to be Walter Straka Day. I sign this today, November 11th, as Mayor of the City of Brainerd. Please all say thank you to Walt. Thank you very much. I'm certain that Walt is probably smiling. I know he's smiling there. He put his hat on and is smiling. Thank you very much. From all of us in the City of Brainerd, thank Walter. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mayor Menk. Our program takes place in a school, and I think it's fitting that we learn a little bit more about our special guest, Mr. Straka. So please, thank you to our Veterans Planning Committee for providing me this information about Mr. Straka. Thomas John Brokaw is an award-winning American broadcast journalist and author of several books, including bestsellers The Greatest Generation and The Greatest Generation Speaks. These two bestsellers tell us great stories about the brave individual men and women who served for our nation during World War II, and they went on to build modern America. Today, Mr. Straka is part of that greatest generation. Mr. Straka was born a Brainerd native on October 24th, 1919. At a young age, he joined the 34th Tank Company, the Brainerd National Guard Unit, which later became the hometown of the 194th Tank Battalion. He left Brainerd on a train with the Tank Battalion in 1941, bound for Fort Lewis, Washington. Later, his journey took him across the Pacific Ocean on the ship SS President Coolidge from San Francisco, arriving in Manila, Philippines on September 26, 1941. His World War II experience started with the hard-fought battles of defending Bataan and on the island of Luzon, Philippines, until ordered to surrender to the Japanese Imperial Army on April 9, 1942. Following the surrender, he endured the 6-day death march, suffering from starvation, lack of food and water, extreme heat and humidity, rifle butt to the spine, malaria, and dysentery. Adding to all this misery was the constant onslaught of insects, all of this contributing to the lack of sleep. 16,950 people died in the death march. His journey would continue in the lower hold of the Japanese hell ship, surviving on rotting fish until reaching Japan 41 days later. As a prisoner of war in Japan, he was slave labor in the Yawata Steelworks in Kokura, Japan. His POW campsite in Japan was Fukuoka Prison number 3. Mr. Straka was a prisoner of war for 43 months, and he survived with a final weigh-in at a mere 89 pounds. Mr. Straka returned to Brainerd to become a successful businessman, owning a used car lot and a construction company. He married and had a family of 7 children, all who graduated from college. His message to young people, in his words, get an education for one thing, stay in school, and get a work ethic. I would like to, again, on behalf of Brainerd High School, thank Mr. Straka for his service and congratulate him for his accomplishments. And again, let's honor him with a round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Straka. We are so fortunate today to have so many veterans here at Brainerd High School to honor you. At this time, let us recognize and honor our veterans who have served in foreign conflict for our country. I'd ask the audience to please hold your applause until all service members are standing and can be recognized. Veterans, I'd ask you to please stand and remain standing as I announce your service time. We have veterans of World War II here today, including Cliff Carlson and Art Nystrom. So veterans of World War II, if you could please stand. Korean War veterans, please stand. Vietnam War veterans, and remain standing. Vietnam War veterans. Persian Gulf veterans. Iraq War conflict veterans. Afghanistan conflict veterans. I'd like to, at this time, also ask our current BHS students who have pledged to serve our country and committed, please stand at this time. All other service men and women here today, including our current students who have served our country during our peacetime, would those veterans please stand? Look around this gymnasium. Look at the men and women who have served our country during war, conflict, and during peacetime to ensure our freedoms. I'd ask you, please, students, staff, and guests, join me in a round of applause to thank and recognize our servicemen and women. Thank you, veterans. Thank you, veterans. I'd also, at this time, like to recognize some very special veterans to me because they do the heavy lifting of planning this wonderful program. Men volunteer their time and their energies to make sure that we have an outstanding Veterans Day program here today. So I'd like to thank Charlie Ekstrand, Tom Swanson, Tom Leach, Jerry Strobel, Eric Flowers, Larry Oswald, and Susan Fussy for their help. Thank you all for your help in this program. Each year, we invite a veteran, active military person to come and speak to us at Brainerd High School. We'd like to welcome our honored speaker today, Colonel Joshua Seimer, Minnesota Army National Guard. Colonel Seimer joined the U.S. Army in 1997 after completing the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC program. He served on active duty for 7 years, stationed in Texas, in South Korea, and also completed 1 deployment to the Middle East. Since 2004, he has served in the Minnesota Army National Guard. He has deployed with the Guard to Iraq and to Kuwait, and he has served with the 194th Tank Battalion in Brainerd as both the Operations Officer, S3, and as the Battalion Commander. He is currently assigned as the Deputy Operations Officer, G3, of the Minnesota National Guard. Please help me welcome Colonel Seimer.
Thank you, and I apologize for the rough sound of my voice. I kind of shouted myself hoarse cheering the Gophers on Saturday. So, now the good news, of course, for the Gophers is this is the best season they've had and the longest winning streak they've had since 1940 to 41. The bad news, especially for you currently in the 194th or any of you who have enlisted and may be joining the 194th, is the last time the Gophers had a winning streak this long, we got deployment orders to the Philippines. So, as we talk and as we remember these things, we remember people, like, we honor people well, we remember all of those who served with them. Sometimes, as time goes on, we forget the bigger context. What was actually going on? Why did Walt and his fellow members of the 194th end up in the Philippines? Why did all these things happen to them? And what did it mean? And especially with the war in the Pacific, we remember some of the events, but for obvious reasons, because of what was happening in Europe and because of the profound evil that Nazi Germany represented, we tend to have an easier time remembering why we were fighting in Europe, and sometimes it gets lost why we were fighting in the Pacific. So, as I might need a little help. There we go. And so as I go through this, we'll have some images. The text is probably a little too small to read, but don't worry about that. We'll talk a little bit more about why these things happened and what they meant. So first, why were we fighting Japan? Why did this war break out? Well, actually, the war in the Pacific had broken out well before the attack on Pearl Harbor, which I'm sure everyone in here is familiar with. The Japanese in 1931 had invaded and taken part of northern China and formed a puppet state they called Manchukuo, and then in 1937 invaded the rest of China. Now, the main reason they did this was because they were led by a militaristic government that also had, somewhat analogous to Nazi Germany, a clear idea that they were racially superior and had this racially inherent right to dominate and enslave all the countries around them. So with China, they invaded China because they felt they were entitled to China's natural resources and because they wanted to use the Chinese for slave labor. Remember that slave labor term, because that's going to come up again later as we talk more about the 194th and what Walt and his friends went through. And again, we often focus on the scale of atrocities that happened in Europe, and rightfully so, but we often forget in the course of this war, especially from 1937 to 1945, 14 million Chinese died in that war. Some of them were soldiers, the vast majority were civilians. In fact, in one incident that we often forget about, after the Doolittle raids, which was the first U.S. bombing of Japan proper after we entered the war, the Japanese went on a hunt for any Chinese who were helping out the American pilots who had participated in this raid, and did things like poison and put biological weapons into the water supply of villages that they thought helped. And in fact, an estimated 250,000 Chinese were murdered just in response to the Doolittle raid in April of 1942 alone. You see similar numbers across the rest of the Pacific as the war expanded. 4 million died in Indonesia, which was then called the Dutch East Indies. Perhaps as many as a million Filipinos died. And so in 1941, as these things were developing, especially Japanese actions in China, the U.S. and allies took steps against Japan to encourage them to stop. The most critical of these was an oil embargo in 1941, saying we're going to stop selling you oil, the U.S. won't sell you oil, the Netherlands, East Indies won't sell you oil. Now the Japanese had no oil fields of their own, none worth speaking of. So this was critical for them. So they had a choice. Well, we can do what the Americans and their allies are asking and stop, or we can just go take the oil. So, because they had this philosophy that they were racially superior and could defeat everybody else and were entitled to take what they wanted, they said, well, we're going to go take the oil. Let's go seize Indonesia, again then the Netherlands, East Indies. Well, the Philippines were in the way. The Philippines were a U.S. possession and had been since the Spanish-American War. Now there was a plan to give the Philippines their independence in 1946. One of the reasons it had taken so long for the U.S. to agree to let the Philippines become independent, and why this was scheduled for 1946, was precisely the concern that if the U.S. moved out, Japan would just move right back in and the Philippines wouldn't actually achieve their independence. So there was a plan to gradually develop the Philippine army to where they could defend themselves. But it was not by any means complete. In fact, it was well behind schedule in 1941. So how was the 194th Tank Battalion from Brainerd involved? Well, it's pretty clear from both what was going on in Europe and Japan already in 1940 that we were very likely to end up being in the war. So a draft was started in 1940, and in early 1941, National Guard units started getting called up. So this was 10 months before war broke out, so it was pretty clear something serious was going to happen. And the 194th was sent to defend the Philippines, joining other U.S. forces and this Philippine army that was still in the process of being developed and trained up. So there was a wide variation in how well-trained and well-equipped these Philippine units were, but there were a small number of U.S. Army units there as well. Now the plan, just as an aside, think of who some of these people were from Brainerd and what they had been going through. I had a conversation with Walt Straka just a couple of months ago talking about growing up in Brainerd during the 1930s, during the Depression, and how he felt like his family was very well off, one of the wealthier families around, because they had 3 meals every day, three good solid meals. So that was some of what was going on here. Another nice anecdote, I know that another soldier, no longer with us, but who survived Bataan, said that one of the reasons he joined the National Guard was there's this big holiday party every Christmas at the Armory. It was a dance, it was a big deal in town, and he said he really wanted to take his date there, and a couple of his friends did too, but they couldn't afford the tickets, but if they joined the National Guard, they got free tickets. Okay, there's lots of good reasons to join the National Guard, but that ended up being a really expensive date. So, a few years after that, the 194th, which includes the company that originally come from Brainerd, as well as companies from other parts of the country, and another tank battalion also that was formed similarly from separate National Guard tank companies around the country, they all end up in the Philippines. So the plan is, okay, we know we're not going to be able to defeat the Japanese with the forces we have there, but what we can do is fight what's called a delaying action, meaning just slow them down, withdraw to this place called the Bataan Peninsula, which is easy to defend, and we'll hold out there until the U.S. Pacific Fleet can bring reinforcements. Well, things did not go according to plan. The attack on Pearl Harbor devastated the Pacific Fleet. Now, it was already questionable whether the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have enough strength to fight against the entire Japanese navy and actually bring supplies to Bataan and the Philippines in time, but any chance there was of that plan working was gone within 5 minutes of the start of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So rather than having to hold out for months, it would take years for the Pacific Fleet to recover and fight back across the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese, you can see that map in the lower right, they advanced quickly across the Pacific. So you can see that red line outlines more or less where the Japanese were able to reach by April or May of 1942. Bataan, where the star is well behind that. So you can see pretty quickly there was no realistic chance of getting supplies or reinforcements to Bataan. So the U.S. and Filipino forces there were completely cut off. And in retrospect, there were a lot of indications and a lot of senior leaders knew even before the war that this plan was unrealistic and was not likely to work, and that the forces in the Philippines really would have no hope of being reinforced, withdrawn, or resupplied. Nevertheless, despite this and despite mistakes that led to them not having the pre-positioned supplies they expected in the Bataan Peninsula, they held out for several months. And this is very significant because elsewhere in the Pacific, the Japanese were advancing and it seemed like nothing could stop them. There were other fortresses that the U.S. and allies had that we all thought would hold out longer, some of which were supposed to be impregnable, meaning they couldn't be taken, and they fell quickly. Hong Kong fell within days. Singapore fell within a couple of weeks to a Japanese attack, and Singapore was a very heavily fortified British outpost at the time. The Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, also fell very quickly. Burma, now known as Myanmar, fell very quickly. The Japanese were on the edge of India, which was then a British possession. And across many islands in the Pacific, the Japanese landed, and there was only one area where they got slowed down. Wake Island resisted and fought back, defeated the first Japanese attack, but within a week, a second Japanese attack came and captured that island. So all this seemed like the Japanese had figured something out. They were unstoppable, except in the Philippines. There, we, American and Filipino forces, fought the Japanese to a standstill, and even at one point, forced the Japanese to pull back and regroup. It would be hard to understate how significant that was. Just imagine, all of the news is bad from everywhere, Europe, Asia, except one spot where people are holding out, one spot where the Japanese are forced to regroup, where their timetable is thrown off. And so across the country, Bataan became a rallying cry. People focused on that. It made headlines even before the final battle. Ultimately, as we know, this couldn't last forever. The 194th and the other U.S. and Filipino forces were on starvation rations from the beginning of this 4-month battle. By the time it ended, they were on a quarter of what would ordinarily be considered a survival or normal rate of rations for people, and even that was beginning to run out. And finally, weakened by that, the Japanese launched a final offensive, and U.S. leaders were forced to surrender. But even after all that, keep in mind, the soldiers of the 194th and the other Americans and Filipinos fighting with them, the soldiers did not surrender. Their leaders, they were fighting on. The leaders ordered them to surrender because time had run out, and clearly they couldn't accomplish anything more. The soldiers kept that spirit. And for that, they faced another 3.5 years of suffering. So, imagine this, you're already starving. You've been on less than what you need to keep going and can survive for about 4 months already. Now, after the surrender, a couple of things went wrong. First, the Japanese weren't prepared for the number of people who surrendered. But secondly, think back, they had this idea of a militaristic society, racial superiority. They looked down on the Americans and Filipinos, and they looked down on people who would surrender rather than fight to the death. And that contributed to the Bataan Death March. Remember, for every American who died in the Bataan Death March, as many as 16 Filipinos died as well. So already starving, already weak, you have to march 100 miles or more under the constant abuse of guards with no chance to get water or food resupply. And then, if you survive that, you have 3.5 more years in a POW camp where you continue to get insufficient rations, continue to receive abuse. And what was the purpose of these POW camps? Slave labor. So the Japanese did not view their prisoners as prisoners of war to be protected, secured. They viewed them as slaves, people who had disgraced themselves and whose only use now was as slave labor. So after many years in this, in fact, roughly 75 years ago today as we speak, American and Allied forces were starting to liberate the Philippines. We had landed on the island of Leyte, and we were beginning to advance through the Philippines to liberate them. So the Japanese again had a choice. We can leave these POWs here to be liberated, or we can move them to other parts of the empire to use as slave labor. Needless to say, they chose the latter. And that's where this phenomena of the hell ships, as you see in the upper right, comes in. The hell ships were intended purely to move this slave labor to other parts of the empire to continue using it, and not be liberated by the Americans. So they threw the prisoners into the cargo holds of these ships. They were cargo ships, not passenger ships. No ventilation, no food, no water, no sanitation facilities whatsoever. So you had to go to the bathroom, there was no place to go, just go right there. So standing in filth, no chance to see the sun, no chance to see the sky. Survivors of the hell ships write about people going insane in the holds of these ships and attacking each other, trying to drink blood, cause wounds and drink blood from the other prisoners' arms. The other thing was these ships were unmarked. Now, the Geneva Convention says you're transporting POWs, you have to mark the transport. Japanese didn't do that, and American air power and submarine power was so dominant by this late point in the war that a lot of these ships got sunk. And one survivor of the hell ship wrote that when the torpedo hit the ship that he was on, he heard other prisoners thanking God that the torpedo had hit and that they were drowning because it was their suffering was finally over. For those that were in ships that were attacked, generally the Japanese would either keep them locked below decks as the ship sank, and sometimes would machine gun them in the water afterwards. Because now that they were no longer useful as slave labor, they didn't have any way to transport them, the idea was you might as well kill them. Eventually, the surviving POWs were liberated, but only approximately half of those who left, only half of those who were alive at the start of the war would ever return. For Brainerd, it was only 29 of the 61 who had left with the 34th Tank Company that became Alpha Company 194th Tank Battalion. Only 29 of those 61 ever returned. Now, when they returned, it wasn't over for them. You can imagine after 3.5 years of that experience, Walt has given interviews talking about dealing with the aftermath of that and having continual nightmares for the rest of his life. Spouses of the surviving baton veterans have talked about that as well. Many of them had their health wrecked. My predecessor in command of the 194th, Colonel Ernest Miller, he survived about 14 years after the war, but his health had been devastated by this effect as well, and he ended up dying from something that may well have been connected to his time as a POW at the age of 59, and others died prematurely from other causes as well. Now others, fortunately, another nice anecdote, others had some more pleasant surprises. Ken Porwell, for example, was told by his doctors when he got back to the United States, you know, your health has been wrecked. Among other things, you will never be able to have children after this. He was very disappointed, but I remember at his memorial service 6 years ago, when they told the story, his 9 children thought that was very amusing. So, why is it important to remember what these POWs went through, what our Brainerd area and American and Filipino baton veterans went through? Well, part of it's because of what they achieved. So on the left you can see they achieved the liberation of East Asia and the Pacific from this Japanese regime, which in its own way was extremely repressive, different in character from Nazi Germany, but still extremely evil. And thanks to their efforts, the Japanese attack was delayed and the eventual liberation was able to happen sooner. But also, we remember because they helped liberate Japan too from this regime. The Japanese people also suffered terribly, whether the ones who were sent off to fight in what for Japan was a needless war, the civilians at home who ended up suffering as well from starvation, bombing attacks, etc., as the U.S. closed the noose around Japan and launched air raids at devastated Japanese cities. And after World War II, they were liberated from this regime, and they had a democratic government that respected human rights. So across East Asia and even Japan itself, our World War II veterans achieved that liberation and brought freedom and justice and human rights to a huge group of people. Finally, we remember because it's part of our national heritage, and especially here in Brainerd, it's such a strong part of our local heritage, and there have been documentaries made that focused on this group from Brainerd because it is such an important, touching story, and because it has such a strong connection to a particular community, a community that to this day remembers that connection and has events like this where we get together and we remember, and we talk about it, and we make it something that is real to us and something we discuss and is part of our current lives, not just something we read in a textbook somewhere. And you can go to Memorial in Brainerd, go past the National Guard Armory, and see how we remember. And to this day, we still have the headquarters of the 194th Tank Battalion here, and as far as I know, we always will, because of that connection, because of this community, because of the heritage that Walt Straka and the others of the original 194th Tank Battalion brought, but also because this is a community that today, in 2019, still believes this is important and has events like this to make that connection. And to this day, in the 194th Tank Battalion, we still have this motto, and it is reinforced by the community leaders and by the members of the community who show up and pay your respects at events like this. Remember Baton, never forget. Thank you for helping to remember. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your attention. Remember what we've talked about here today. Remember Baton, never forget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Seimer. What a wonderful message for us today. I recently read an article that was shared with me about thanking a service member for their service. The article shared how appreciation in words is important, but more important is to go beyond a thank you to show interest in the service of a veteran. Go beyond the words and move into action to help our veterans and those who are serving our country right now. 11 years ago, we honored Brigadier General Mark Ness at our program, and his message of that day is one that I reference each year. Brigadier General Ness talked about how meaningful 5 simple words could be to a veteran. And I'd like to share them with our veterans here today. Thank you for your service. And especially today, General Ness, welcome. It's nice to see you back here. I'd encourage our students to seek out a veteran you know, or maybe a veteran you don't know, today and in your future, and thank them for their service. I'd like to now welcome Sue Carroll up to the podium to award the Quilts of Honor to our veterans. Sue is involved in our local chapter of Quilts of Gratitude, which is a member of the Minnesota Quilts of Honor. So Sue, and then I'd ask you to hold your applause until the end, where we can recognize this very, very generous gift.
Okay. Thank you. Veterans Day is actually the anniversary of the signing of the armistice, which ended World War I. The war ended in 1918. The first Veterans Day was 1919. So today is the 101st Veterans Day, where we honor and thank veterans for their service to the United States. Gail Belmont of Valley Springs, California is a veteran of the Vietnam era and had played taps numerous times for the fallen as part of her service to the country. She did not want any of our warriors to be forgotten. Between 2004 and early 2010, Gail and thousands of quilters across the United States worked with an organization providing patriotic quilts to those service members touched by the current conflicts. In April 2010, Gail's passion and mission for providing comfort and healing to our warriors and veterans had grown ever stronger. With the help of those who had stood beside her, Quilts of Honor was formed, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing healing, loving quilts to those who have served in harm's way, protecting our freedoms. Gail is now the executive director of Quilts of Honor. We call our local group Quilts of Gratitude. It is the Minnesota chapter of Quilts of Honor, as Andrea said. The mission of Quilts of Gratitude and Quilts of Honor is to bestow a universal symbol and token of thanks, solace, and remembrance to those who serve in harm's way to protect and defend our lives and freedoms. We are all volunteers. Some of the group meets the second and fourth Tuesday of the month at Country Fabrics here in Brainerd to assemble quilt kits and finish quilts, while others piece quilts, quilt the quilts, or apply the binding at home. We have nearly 100 volunteers, women and men, working on different aspects of these quilts. Quilts consist of 3 layers held together by quilting stitches. We like to think of the layers in this way. First, the top of the quilt with its many colors, shapes, and fabrics represents the many individuals that make up a community. Second, the batting, the filler, is the center of the quilt. It represents our hope that this quilt will bring warmth, comfort, peace, and healing to the individual who receives it. And thirdly, the backing is the strength that supports the other layers. It represents the veterans' strength, the support of family, community, and our nation. Each stitch that holds the layers together represents love, gratitude, and sometimes the tears of the maker. Our quilts are presented through the St. Cloud VA, the Brainerd Outpatient Clinic, County Veteran Service Officers, hospice organizations, and via requests from the public. Before year end, our small local group will have distributed our 4,000th quilt. With our deepest appreciation, we thank you, the special guest being honored today, with a Quilt of Honor award. On behalf of the Quilts of Honor Foundation and Quilts of Gratitude, it is our honor today to award quilts to 13 individuals. So at this time, I'm going to ask those presenting quilts to stand. We will display the quilt and then I will announce the recipient. Please hold your applause until they are all displayed. So the first recipient is Melvin Dahlberg. He served in the Air Force in the Korean conflict. I understand he is not able to be with us today, but a quilt will be given to him in person. Second, Milton Halverson. Milton served in the Navy during the Korean conflict. I believe he is here today. Milton, can you please stand or raise your hand? Please hold your applause. Next is David Klang. He served us in the Army during the Korean conflict, and David is here with us today. The next quilt is for Albert Leonard. He served in the Navy during World War II. Albert is unable to be with us today. Next is Alan MacArthur. He served us also in the Navy in World War II. Alan is also unable to be here today. Next is James Mark. He served us in the Army during the Korean conflict, and he is here with us today. Thank you, James. Next is Frank Neshin, served in the Army during the Korean conflict. And I believe Frank is here with us today. Can you stand or raise your hand, Frank? Next is Arthur Nystrom, Air Force, World War II. And Arthur is with us today as well. Next is Bernard Selinger, Air Force, World War II. Bernard is here with us today. The next is for James Thompson, served in the Army in the Korean War. James is unable to be here today. And next is Chuck Watson from the Navy, World War II. And Chuck is standing over here on the side. The next quilt was for John Williams, Navy, Korean conflict. John is unable to be here with us today. And then lastly, we'd like to honor Joshua Slimer from the Minnesota National Guard, currently active. I'd like to give them a round of applause, please. Although we may never know the depth of your sacrifice to protect and defend our freedoms, it is our hope that this quilt will provide comfort, love, and healing because you have given so much. Thank you.
That's me. This is to you. That's you. Again, this year we have a special musical performance. Our chamber orchestra, wind symphony ensembles will be performing together while all members of our choral ensembles will sing. The piece that they are playing is America the Beautiful, and the groups are under the direction of Mr. Stubbs, Mr. Ali, Mr. Fadrud, Ms. Olson, and Ms. Kopp. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have wonderful music here, and thanks to each and every one of our musicians for that outstanding selection. To conclude our program today, I'd like to thank the following people here at Brainerd High School for their work on this program. In addition to our directors of our music, I'd like to thank Mr. Dwyer and all of the members of the video productions class, Sean Tollefson, Ms. Borden, Ms. Andrist, Shirley Freeman, Ms. Converse, the ASL students, all the students who volunteered from our government class today to help decorate and set up our Brainerd High School custodial staff for all of their contributions and work for this program. Our veterans who have helped with this program wanted to give students a United States flag as a symbol of our freedom and also a reminder to us of the service our veterans have given to this country. Thank you to the American Legion and to our Brainerd Public School District for giving our flags to the students. Out of respect for the American flag, however, students, if you so choose not to keep it, we'd ask you to kindly hand it back to our volunteers who are here today so that we may give them out next year and for many years to come. Members of our community, I would invite you to stay for cookies and coffee after we conclude the program here at the back of the gymnasium. I'm sorry, students, they're not for you. You may have heard the grumbling there. So, students and staff, community, I want to thank you not only for your attendance, but your respect today for this important program. We conclude our program by having members of our American Legion post 255. We have them come in and retrieve the colors at the end of the program. We also will have students playing taps. We would ask everyone to please quietly stand while the colors are retrieved from this program. Quietly, please.